A Forgotten Hero, My Family's Tuskegee Airmen Connection. During World War II, men and women from both my parents' families served in the armed forces. However, none were known or talked about to have served in the prestigious military unit we all know of today as the Tuskegee Airmen, the infamous 332nd Fighter Group, who were the first group of African Americans allowed to overcome segregation policy to fly airplanes for the United States military. Historically, other African Americans did fly planes during World War I, but because of legal segregation and stiff resistance from the United States military, early pioneers of minority pilots like Eugene Bullard flew in support of other Allied armies. I discovered 3 years ago that my mother's uncle, a Lieutenant Jimmie Wheeler, was a Tuskegee Airman and gave his life for our country. No one in my mother's family ever spoke of or mentioned this fallen hero. He was the only kin that I know of to have died in the war from combat action. Upon entering military service, he was happily married and a father of 2 daughters whom I have never met. He volunteered for the Tuskegee program and entered flight service training for black pilots at Selfridge Air Base in suburban Detroit, Michigan. From there, he continued his training at the infamous Tuskegee training site in Alabama. The only pictures we have of him are found in the Library of Congress taken at the 332nd Fighter Group Air Base in Ramatelli, Italy in 1945. Ironically, they were taken around the time of his death in March 1945, 2 months before the war officially ended. We see him wearing flight goggles and headgear, both standing and sitting during pre-combat mission briefs prior to conducting raids into southern Germany to attack German logistics infrastructure and military forces. It is amazing that very efficient records were kept of his service in both government documents and historical writings, which have helped to piece together where my great-uncle was during the war and how he died in the service of the nation. Why Tuskegee? The Army and government knew that additional pilot replacements would be needed, and so officials in support of integration supported the training of black fighter pilots. Colonel Charles McGee, a war survivor and Tuskegee Airman, was interviewed on his experience.
There was the build-up, there was the draft taking place for training, and as an American, I wanted to do my part. It was really my motivation. If somebody asked me if the military was a desired career, I would have probably said no. But it was the environment that we were in, that the build-up all across the country to support our allies in Europe. I was in the engineering program and taking ROTC. My instructor perhaps planted the seed that maybe I would apply for the flying side of the program that began in 1941. The Army was going to experiment and allow some training of black aviators, so I applied for that aviation training and was accepted and got the call to go down to Tuskegee. They had been involved in the civilian pilot training program, but the Army was still saying no to those pilots who had gotten their private pilot's license and wanted to get Army training. They didn't even believe blacks could fly. Out of some studies that were done earlier, at least that was their conclusions. It wasn't a real study, I don't think, because they didn't get the facts right. So their policy was not taking blacks into the aviation corps. And the only blacks they were enlisting were entered into service squadrons to do labor. Well, it was authorized in 1940, but they got the training underway in 1941. They had authorized a squadron of training for black pilots, which had not existed in the Army Air Corps. It's something that we had always said, give us the opportunity. Before, we had been told you can't do something, but had never been given the chance to do it.
It is no doubt my great-uncle was inspired by the same motivation as Colonel McGee. The Tuskegee experiment was an initiative by the Roosevelt administration and publicly supported by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to fight discrimination in the military and in American culture. As war approached and was anticipated, Congress passed the 1940 Selective Service and Training Service Act, and President Roosevelt signed it into law on September 16, 1940. This act was also known as the Burke-Wadsworth Act and was the first peacetime draft legislation in the history of the United States. There was specific wording within the legislation that addressed racial discrimination, a forerunner to desegregating the military. It stated that, within the limits of the quota determined, any person, regardless of race or color, shall be afforded an opportunity to volunteer for induction, and, in the selection and training of men under this act, there shall be no discrimination against any person on the account of race or color. In that same year of 1940, the War Department announced that the Civil Aeronautics Authority, in cooperation with the United States Army, would start the official development of colored personnel for the aviation service. Large numbers of black pilot candidates came from cities like New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, and of course Detroit, which was known during the war as the Arsenal of Democracy because of the nation's heavy reliance on Detroit's retooled auto industry assembly lines to produce war materials on a mass effort. The military was finally desegregated in 1948 by President Truman's Executive Order 9981, which directed equality of treatment and opportunity to all in the United States Armed Forces. Former Tuskegee Airman Colonel McGee provides some insight into the desegregation of the military.
I came home just past mid-November of '44. By this time, the combat returnees began to replace the white instructors that had taught us at Tuskegee, and so I ended up as an instructor. The war ended, about April of '45, and the group was one deactivated as the war ended. The planning for the Air Force to become a separate service, which took place in 1947, the Air Arm separated from the Army, and our United States Air Force was born. The Air Force looked at the experience, found out that we as blacks could perform up to the standard. All we needed was the opportunity that they intended to integrate. Even President Truman, a few months later in '48, issued a couple of very important executive orders, but 9981 mandated that all of the services should take action toward integration.
Lieutenant Wheeler and other black fighter pilots trained at Tuskegee would be assigned to one unit which was activated on October 13, 1942, under the 332nd Fighter Group. My uncle was eventually assigned to the 99th Fighter Squadron within the group and flew the infamous P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was among the best and most well-known long-range tactical fighters used by the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. The P-51 was a formidable fighting aircraft. Its armament included 6 50 cal machine guns, had a maximum speed of 437 miles per hour, a range of over 1,000 miles, and could climb to a ceiling of 41,900 feet, well above where modern civilian aircraft fly today. While serving in the European theater, Lieutenant Wheeler flew combat missions from the 332nd Fighter Group's base in Ramitelli, Italy. The 99th Fighter Squadron and the 332nd Fighter Group had a total of 112 aerial combat victories during the war, in addition to destroying other significant targets on the ground in support of the war effort. The 99th Fighter Squadron earned 2 Distinguished Unit citations, and these actions have made my family proud of my great-uncle's contributions to the Tuskegee Airmen and the nation. We know from historical reporting Lieutenant Wheeler was involved in attacking infrastructure and logistical elements of the German military. He was credited with destroying resupply locomotives on long-range missions into southern Germany. His efforts and contributions were instrumental to the overall mission and success of the 332nd Fighter Group and the 99th Fighter Squadron. We now know from military records in Lieutenant Wheeler's wingman's after-action report that he died while on a long-range combat mission into southern Germany. The official report states that at 13:20 hours on 16 March 1945, my great-uncle died in an attack on German logistical targets after he struck some trees coming out of a steep dive to destroy German supply trains at the rail marshalling yard in Waldorf, Germany. Lieutenant Wheeler's wingman reported that in his attempt to pull out of a steep dive attack, he destroyed a train but failed to clear all of the ground canopy, and his left wing struck a tree, spinning him out of control and crashed nearby with the plane exploding in flames. This story was reported to relatives years ago but was somehow forgotten until recently. The same target site at Waldorf was attacked again 2 weeks later by B-24 bombers due to its significance. Photos taken by a B-24 bombardier shows a rail marshalling site which is covered by smoke and aerial debris from bomb explosions. This photo helps to associate the loss and to emotionally identify with a location on the ground where Lieutenant Wheeler actually died. Luckily, my great-uncle's remains were recovered by German civilians and given a respectable burial on the grounds of a local church. Witness statements from the town mayor and a state police officer provided a description and condition of his body after the crash and identified where the burial site was located. After hostilities ended, Lieutenant Wheeler's remains were removed from Germany and interred at the Lorraine American Cemetery and Memorial Site in the Republic of France. The Overseas American Cemetery site appears to be a very beautiful location from photos provided and very well kept. Services and programs honoring the heroism of the fallen are conducted all year round on American holidays, and flowers may be placed at the grave site to honor the memory of those heroes. I hope soon to visit both the cemetery and the town where my great-uncle died. The Tuskegee Airmen will live on forever in the annals of American history because men like my great-uncle accepted the challenge to proudly serve their nation despite the unfair treatment they experienced. They proved to the world that black men could fly planes and do so heroically. Pioneers like my great-uncle displayed skill and determination while suppressing their internal rage from humiliation and indignation caused by social injustice within our society. The Tuskegee Airmen fought 2 wars and won them both. A double V victory, one against the enemy forces overseas and the other against legal segregation at home. Well done, Lieutenant Wheeler. We salute you and may you forever rest in peace. Your legacy continues to inspire and motivates millions to ascend to greatness. Aim high.